And thank you all so much for coming. I'm happy to be here and happy to be a longtime friend of the festival. So my mom spent hours and weeks and months trying to make this happen. And I think it was largely so she could show this photo of me, which there might be a slide of. This is when I was 17 years old. I was a Senate page for Mitchell in, I think, 93 and 94. When I was a junior in high school at Waterville Senior High School, which is also where Senator Mitchell graduated from. And it remains one of the most educational 6 months of my life. So I'm happy to introduce him. He was a Democratic senator from Maine from 1980 to 1995, as well as the majority leader from 89 to 95. He was the primary architect of the 1998 Good Friday Agreement for Peace in Northern Ireland, chairman of the Walt Disney Company, U.S. Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, and the author of the Mitchell Report on performance-enhancing drugs in baseball. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1999, and this is his 5th book, The Negotiator, Reflections on an American Life. He'll be in conversation with your local scribe, Dyke Hendrickson, who is a great friend, mentor, tennis partner, drinking buddy, and father to me and my brother Drew. Thank you so much. Welcome, Senator Mitchell and Dyke Hendrickson.
Thank you very much. If you suspected nepotism going on here, we have Vicki, we have Leslie, we have myself. Our son Drew is here, and he plans to offer a presentation of Down East yodeling a little later in the day. But it's all free labor, so. But the key person, of course, is Senator Mitchell. And we're honored to have you here, Senator. And we're talking about your book, The Negotiator. One thing I wanted to ask you, you grew up in modest circumstances in Waterville. Your mother worked in the mills. Your father was a custodian at Colby, and there were times when he wasn't working. Do you think this humble background, albeit with a loving family, had something to do with your frame of reference in life, or getting along with people, or somehow negotiating your way?
Yes, I do, and I will expand on that in a moment, but I want to begin by thanking you and Vicki and Leslie for inviting me to be here. It's a great pleasure. I've been friends of Dyke's for a long time, and Vicki's, and speaking of authors, I reminded Dyke earlier that he wrote a terrific book years ago on the journey of Franco-Americans from Quebec into northern New England, including Maine, years ago. And when I was in the Senate, I remember reading it. It was one of the most informative books about my constituents that I had read. And so, I don't know if it's still in print, but you're nice to be here promoting my book, and so I want to say a few good words about your book.
We'll get it back into print.
Yeah. I do want to begin with a story. I speak often. I spoke early this morning at Harvard, last night at Wheaton, and so I've heard myself talk so much that for me the highlight of any program is the introduction. And I want to thank Leslie for a very generous introduction, a personal one, particularly putting that photo up to remind me how long I've been around. But it's very nice to have pleasant things said of you in public before people you don't even know. But the risk to it is, of course, that if you hear it often enough, you may begin to believe it, and that's dangerous to one's mental health. So I always like to begin with a story, a true story about introductions and how I was brought back down to earth. I spent several years in Northern Ireland. I chaired 3 separate sets of discussions over a span of about 5 years. When I returned home to Maine, I wrote a book about that experience. It's my book before this one, called Making Peace. And when it was published, I went on a book promotion tour. I received many invitations, and in the process I learned the interesting fact that in the United States there are more Irish American organizations than there are Irish Americans. And every one of them sent me an invitation. Of course, I couldn't go to all, but I went to many. And as I traveled around the country speaking primarily to Irish American groups, that developed among them an informal competition as to who could give the longest, most fantastic, often truly ridiculous introductions of me. The proper reaction would have been for me to show some humility, to encourage them to keep it short, to cut it back. I had an improper reaction. I loved it. I encouraged them. I scolded them when they left something out. In Chicago, a guy stood up and with a long list read for 35 minutes everything I'd ever done in my life, including many things that I had not been aware of until he read them off. And when he finished, I scolded him because he did not include that in my junior year at Waterville High School, I received the Science Award. So by the time I got to the last stop, Stamford, Connecticut, the Stamford Irish American Society, I was overly impressed with myself. I had a hard time squeezing my head through the front door. But when I get in, the first person I encountered was an elderly woman who rushed up to me, very excited and nervous, shook my hand, and spent several minutes telling me what a great man I am, the wonderful things I've done all over the world. And she concluded by saying, I don't live anywhere near here. I drove 3.5 hours all across the state of Connecticut just to ask you, please, would you autograph my poster? So she handed me a poster with a photograph and a pen. I looked at it. I said, I'd be very happy to autograph your poster, but before I think there's something I should tell you. She said, what is it? I said, I'm not Henry Kissinger. She said, you're not? Well, who are you anyway? And when I told her, she said, why, that's just terrible. She said, I drove 3.5 hours to meet a great man named Kissinger, and all I've got is a nobody like you. I said, oh, I'm sorry you feel so bad. I wish there's something I could do. And she thought for a moment. She said, well, there is. When I asked her what it was, she leaned forward. I leaned forward. Our foreheads were touching, and in a conspiratorial whisper, she said, nobody will ever know the difference. She said, would you mind signing Henry Kissinger's name to my poster? So I did. And it's hanging today on her living room wall in eastern Connecticut, a daily reminder to me to listen and enjoy those words, but don't take them too seriously when you get introduced. So, to get back to your question, yes, I think it made a big difference in my life. I wrote this book for two reasons, one of which was to say something about my parents, to dedicate it to my parents. As you noted, Dyke, my mother was an immigrant from Lebanon. She came here as a teenager. She could not read or write. And she spent 50 years working the night shift in textile mills. My father was the orphan son of Irish immigrants. He never knew his parents. He was raised in a Catholic orphanage in Boston. Ultimately, later, many years later, adopted by an elderly couple from Maine who were not Irish. And he had no education. He worked as a laborer, and you were kind enough to call it a custodian. He was a janitor at Colby College. But because of their efforts, and more importantly because of the openness of American society, after receiving many helping hands, I was able to get an education and go on to become the majority leader of the U.S. Senate. My parents never spoke much. I never really had anyone saying, this is what you should do in life, or here's your values. Only one small conversation with my father later in life. But by example, I learned about the importance of family, work, faith, commitment. We worked from the time we were little kids, came to accept it as a reality, and because my parents' dream was that their children would get an education and lead lives better than they had led, they regarded their lives as very successful, although they lived on the edge of economic failure every day of their lives, and they died penniless. But in fact, each of their children did go on to college, and each of us has led a life that would have been beyond the imagination of my parents. So it had a profound influence, especially my mother, who was, as I point out in the book, the most influential person in my life by far.
You know, in the early 60s, you were working for Senator Muskie, who went on to do a lot of legislation, clean water, which is very helpful to our community here in Newburyport, partly because the river is getting cleaner, the town is having a renaissance. You were involved in clean air and many different aspects. Did you choose your issues when you were young and coming through, or did they kind of find you?
No, the issues found me. Most of what's happened in my life has been accidental, unsought, unintended. I think the great lesson to me is that life is not lived in linear fashion, and while it's good to have plans, it's better still to be able to take advantage of opportunities when they arise. I think chance plays a much larger role in life than most people realize, and in all of our lives there's a lot of step forward, a step backward, step sideward, a lot of zigs and zags and unexpected difficulties and unexpected opportunities. Now, when I got to the Senate, I was influenced by what I had lived as a child. I lived with my parents in what was truly a slum. It was right on the banks of the Kennebec River. The river smelled terribly. It was covered with scum and foam. It was so heavily polluted. The goal of everyone who lived there was to move away from the river. And when I was 6 years old, my father accomplished what to him was a great feat. We moved about 200 yards away from the river and across the railroad tracks. And so I was conscious of the issues of water and air pollution. Ed Muskie had the same experience. He grew up in Rumford, Maine, where there's a paper mill and had a heavy odor. And so though I think all human beings are greatly influenced, in fact, to a degree greater than we know consciously, of our own personal experience, our growing up, the influences that people and circumstances had on us.
You know, when you were Senate Majority Leader, and again your years, I believe, were 1980 to 1995, and the last 6 being Majority Leader, you know, looking at today, we think, you know, it's a discordant Congress. Can you talk a little about the way, you know, you came together and perhaps the way things fell apart a little bit in 94, 95 when there was a shutting down of government and the Republicans seemed to be a little more aggressive at that time?
Well, first, I think context. American politics has always been rough and tumble. A professor at the University of Maine did an article a while ago on the presidential election campaign of 1800. Two men who are national icons in our history were the competitors. John Adams was the incumbent, Thomas Jefferson was the challenger. And she uncovered things that were said about them in the campaign that are far worse than anything that's been said recently. The difference, of course, was those words were written, they were read by very few people, distant in time from where the events occurred. In our case, we now, through the miracle of modern technology, the power and ubiquity of electronic communication, especially television and the negative television advertising, it's much more rough in a profound sense that reaches throughout the whole society and influences and shapes the political campaigns. The cost of it is so exorbitant that it has resulted in what I regard as a corrupt and reckless political system in which huge amounts of money are pouring in out of control and dramatically affecting the action or inaction of members of Congress, the polarization and dysfunction. It was tough when I was there. And so, as I described in my book, when I was elected Majority Leader of the Senate, among my first calls was to Bob Dole, who was the Republican leader in the Senate. And I asked if I could come to see him. He was graciously agreed. I went in to see him. And I said to him, look, you've been here 28 years. I've only been here a couple of years. You know more in your little finger than I'll ever know about Congress. I said, but I've been here long enough to know that these jobs as leaders of the Senate are impossible if we don't trust each other. I said, so I'm here to tell you how I intend to behave toward you and to ask you to behave in the same way toward me. And I then described orally the most basic standards of decency, fair play, honesty in dealings. He was delighted. He shook hands, and to this moment, never once has a harsh word passed between Bob Dole and me in public or in private, even though every single day that the Senate was in session, we disagreed, we competed, we negotiated. Sometimes we were able to reach agreement. When we could not, we left it to the Senate to decide. Sometimes my view prevailed, sometimes his prevailed. We never made it personal. And we never tried to embarrass each other. We never tried to deviate from the issues that we were dealing with. That's harder now. It's a different place, much deeper polarization, much less ability to function across party lines, and drowning in a sea of money that I think has in fact corrupted our system and will make it more difficult unless that is corrected. And I'll be glad to get into that. That's a separate issue, but that's one of the big differences today.
I would mention it. I'm going to be asking the Senator a number of questions, and we will have time for questions from you. As a journalist, what I've always hated to hear from a moderator is, we'll talk about this and that, and if there's any time at the end, we'll have questions. But, you know, there's going to be plenty of time, and so if you do have questions, particularly about politics, the Senator will be able to answer them. What were your thoughts about leaving the Senate? Of course, you went on to numerous different things, but what was your reasoning for leaving?
I entered the Senate by appointment. It's an unusual method. I had been appointed a federal judge in 1977, in 79. I'd served as United States Attorney for a couple of years, from 77 to 79. And then, to my complete surprise, and I think to the surprise of everyone in Maine, Senator Muskie resigned from the Senate to become Secretary of State. And the governor of Maine, Joe Brennan, great guy and a great friend, appointed me to complete Senator Muskie's term. So I didn't plan it, I didn't expect it. It occurred in a manner that was unusual. I had a tough time in the 2 years of his term that I completed. I was way behind in the polls, considered a sure loser, but I was able to win election. In the process of those 2 years and winning election, I decided, I observed, obviously I participated in the Senate, and I observed it in a way much more complete than I'd had any sense before. And I saw how many of them became totally consumed. They had no lives outside the Senate. And I wanted to do the best I could, but I also decided I didn't want to make it my work for the rest of my life, that I would be inhibited in what I was doing if I felt the only thing that mattered was winning election. I was elected to 2 terms by substantial margins, and I recall Muskie saying, better to go while they want you to stay than to wait until they ask you to leave. And so I decided I would leave. Also, I had been divorced for many years. I wanted to get married again, and I did when I left the Senate. That's a joke I tell. I'll conclude this section with a joke. The title of the book is The Negotiator. So I get asked a lot, how do you negotiate? Well, my first bit of advice is to husbands. So I'll tell the husbands here how to negotiate. When I retired from the Senate and got married, I wanted to live in Maine, where I grew up and all my family is, and my wife wanted to live in Manhattan, where she had lived for many years, although she's Canadian by birth. So we negotiated, we compromised, and we live in Manhattan. Tells the husbands here all you need to know about how to negotiate.
And then you moved into some years later, you got involved in Northern Ireland, and you know, it's viewed by many people as, you know, a great triumph. I know you're still connected with people over there. Talk a little, if you would, about, you know, approaching this very difficult problem, which had been much bloodshed, much loss of life, hundreds of years of discord, and, you know, what were some of the things that you took into it in a way to make these people maybe be able to talk at the table.
Yeah. I was greatly aided by my experience in the Senate, in particular my 6 years as Senate Majority Leader. It's a very tough job. The Constitution mentions the office of the Speaker. There's no reference to the Senate Majority Leader. There is no statute. It developed as a custom when the Senate became completely unmanageable early in our country's history, and so the Majority Leader really doesn't have any power. You can go around and ask people to do things that they should be doing without being asked. But it taught me patience. I had a little bit of a temper when I became Senate Majority Leader. I recall getting into arguments and yelling at people and swearing at other senators who were doing terrible things and deserved it, but still didn't. So I learned to control my temper. And I learned to be patient. I learned to listen to others, to speak less. And so when I got to Northern Ireland, all of that helped me. The parties there had a long history, not only of conflict, but of separation and isolation. There was no history of speaking to the other side, let alone listening to what they had to say. And so one of the important tasks that I felt I had was to create a context within which they would actually come together and talk. It was not entirely successful. In the 5 years I was there, not once ever, never was I able to get everybody into the same room at the same time. There were constantly people walking out, being kicked out, people coming back, people leaving. I got most of them together enough to get an agreement. But that's why it took years. It took a long time to establish a process, to establish my authority as an independent and impartial arbiter who would judge the issues fairly, without bias or prejudice either way, and get them to come in and gradually, slowly be able to talk, slowly be able to listen to what the other side have to say. One of the things that is striking about conflict situations, not all, but those that I've been involved in, is that each side has a profound and deeply held sense of victimization. They feel that they have been the victims of terrible, terrible harm inflicted by the others. And what victimization does for you is it not only informs you of your past, but it frees you from the cultural, social, and legal restraints that you otherwise would have. So people who feel they've been victimized often themselves perform acts that we would think of as atrocities because they don't feel the restraints internally justifying it on the grounds of what they've been through. And you find that, surely found that in Northern Ireland. There weren't many people killed, actually, when you think about it in modern terms, about 3,500 in the most recent flare-up. But what those statistics miss is the extent to which there was so much personal brutality. The car bomb was invented in Northern Ireland. The process of kneecapping was invented in Northern Ireland to permanently cripple people by firing bullets through both knees and both ankles. Tremendously brutal beatings which left people maimed and incapacitated for life were very widespread. And it generated both a hostility and a sense of victimization. And to get people to get past that, to be able to see people of the other community in human terms, and to actually listen to what they have to say, to try to understand and then accommodate some of their concerns is a very difficult process. Peacemaking involves physical acts, rebuilding buildings, replacing bridges, creating new institutions, governments, agencies. But the most important thing of all is the hardest thing of all, and that's to change what's in people's hearts and minds. And you can't have genuine peace and reconciliation unless you can change people's hearts and minds. And you don't do that in a week, a month, or a decade. It takes generations, a long time. That's still underway in Northern Ireland. There has been peace for 18 years. The violence has effectively ended. They're using democratic means to compose their differences. But it's still a segregated society. There's still enormous separation and hostility. The school systems are segregated. It'll take a long time and a lot of patience and a lot of understanding. When I go to Northern Ireland, they're hard on themselves. They're self-critical. Oh, it's so terrible here. Look at all this difference. I say, look, I come from the United States. You want to hear about differences, come over there and turn on the television for one night. And you'll see every society has differences and dysfunction. And you can't hold them to a standard higher than others are held. But it's enormously gratifying to me that the war is over. It doesn't mean it'll never return, but there are many people alive today who would not otherwise have been alive. And
it was an arduous task for you, but also quite emotional. You've been back, you've seen people who were youngsters at the time. One young girl was blinded at the time, and you're still in contact. So you must carry a lot of that resolution with you, as well as the work that you did.
I do. I've said many times that I'm an American and very proud of it, but a very large part of my heart and of my emotions will always be in Northern Ireland. In a peculiar way, I'm fulfilled in a way that I really didn't know I was lacking. I mentioned earlier about my father. He was Irish, but he never went to Ireland. He hardly ever spoke of Ireland. He knew nothing about Ireland, except there was a place on a map. And so when I went there, after I left the Senate and at President Clinton's request, I didn't really know or understand much about my Irish heritage. And gradually over time, to be able to spend years walking streets where I used to imagine my grandparents or their grandparents had lived and walked, and we don't know much about my father's history, but just to be in the same place, to understand what it was like there, to learn a lot about their history, which is complex and in many respects tragic, helped me to better comprehend my own heritage. And I guess the older you get, the more you think about things like that. I didn't think of it much as a young man. So I feel in a real sense that I benefited greatly from the opportunity to be of service to the people of Ireland.
Well, I have another question I was going to say just briefly if possible, but it's the Arab-Israeli situation, and I don't think we do briefly on that situation.
No,
but talk a little bit, if you will, about your challenges, with Israel and trying to pull that two sides closer together.
No. The circumstances are much different from in Northern Ireland. Each conflict is different. Each human being is different. There are 7.5 billion people in the world, and there's not one of them exactly like you or me or anyone else here in the audience. So it's inevitable that conflicts are different, and there's no standard solution to all of them. Generally, the conflict in the Middle East is more complicated than in Northern Ireland, more external factors, deeply rooted history and sense of victimization on both sides. Complex because it does not exist in a vacuum. Many Americans tend to think of the Arab-Palestinian conflict without taking into account that within just a few miles you have Syria exploding. Just a few miles further you have Iraq. Just a few hundred miles you have Yemen. You have a whole region where the political order has collapsed and a new order is being born through violence and upheaval. And so it has to be kept in context, and it's very hard because it's subject to those influences. In summary, I will say this, that I don't think there's reason for optimism in the immediate short term. But in 2020, a demographic milestone will have been passed in which in the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there will, for the first time since the creation, modern creation of Israel, there'll be more Arabs than Jews, and it will be a serious turning point for Israel, because if the two-state solution has not come to pass, it will be very difficult for Israel thereafter to be both a Jewish or a democratic state, because they will be in the minority. And you can't have one man, one vote and expect to retain the nature of a Jewish state. And that's going to be a dramatic moment. I think before then, there will be a realization that both sides have something to gain and both have something to lose. In January of 2008, President George W. Bush traveled to Jerusalem, and he made a speech to the leaders of both societies. And he set forth American policy in a way that I personally found persuasive. I didn't agree with everything President Bush did, but I agree on this. And what he basically said to them was that you each should be vested in the other's success, because you can't achieve what you want until they get what they want. The Israelis have a state, a brilliantly successful state. I'm sure many of you have been to Israel. For those of you who haven't, you should go. It is truly inspiring and moving to see what has been built there. They have overwhelming military dominance. They have overwhelming financial superiority over the Palestinians. But what they don't have is security for the people. Israelis live in fear and anxiety, in particular in the recent months with these attacks, these civilian attacks, particularly young people wielding knives and sometimes guns and bombs. The Palestinians, on the other hand, don't have a state. And they are an identifiable people and should have a state. We value and treasure the words of the Declaration of Independence, of the right of people to govern themselves, as one of the highest rights of people possessed anywhere. But they're not going to get a state until the people of Israel have a reasonable and sustainable sense of security. They're not going to get that sense of security until the Palestinians get a state. That's just the reality. And President Bush made the argument very effectively that in order to get what you want, you have to accommodate what they want, and vice versa. And I think that realization will come to pass. It's extraordinarily difficult right now. Both societies are divided. In the Palestinian side, you have the Palestinian Authority and its supporters, who a quarter century ago renounced violence, recognized Israel, entered into agreements, and accept the continuing force of those agreements. Also within Palestinian society, you have Hamas, representing about half the people, who don't recognize Israel, insist on retaining the right to use force to expel what they regard as an illegal occupation, and won't commit to past agreements. So a Palestinian leader who takes steps toward compromising with Israel faces tremendous internal opposition. In Israel, you have a deep and growing sense of hostility to a Palestinian state. Although it is the stated policy of the Prime Minister, he has been for it, against it, and now for it. Members of his cabinet are outspoken in saying there will never be a Palestinian state in the West Bank. There is still a large group of Israelis who believe that the two-state solution is the only possible solution. So any Israeli prime minister who takes risks in moving to accommodate the Palestinians faces a tremendous political opposition at home.
You know, I'm going to put it out to questions now, and if you have a question, particularly about the current political situation, which I think everyone would be interested in the senator's views, please ask. And if you can stand up while doing so, that would be helpful. So,
yes. I come down south, so my accent may be a little off, but very nice, actually. You know, there's another guy that wrote a book about negotiating, and he's currently the pretender to the throne here. We got to the deals. And I didn't know if you had a chance to read it, but as you were going through some of the principles of negotiating, I didn't get the same feeling. He's like, I gotta walk away from things. You know, if you walked away, it would have been all over. Is that correct?
Yes.
You didn't build a wall between the British section and the Irish section. Do you think the wall would have helped? I don't mean,
Yeah.
if you've read his book, could you help us say there's a difference between commercial negotiation and political negotiation?
Well, first, I haven't read the book. There are differences between commercial and political negotiation, particularly conflict resolution. I don't know who the person or persons were who invented the concept of money, but they made possible the resolution of commercial disagreements much easier, because you can reduce it all to a linear issue. How much money? One side wants $1,000, the other side will pay $100, so you negotiate and you end up around $500 or $600. In complex conflict resolution situations, it's more emotions and historical attitudes, so it's much more difficult. Secondly, as far as walls are concerned, I have had experience both in the Middle East and in Northern Ireland where there are walls. Walls achieve a temporary success of respite from the immediate concern. In the case of Israelis, from suicide bombings. In the case of Northern Ireland, separation of Catholics and Protestants, making violence upon each other more difficult. But walls also enshrine the problem. It doesn't end the problem. It produces a temporary respite, and it doesn't solve the problem, and there is no wall that ultimately can't be got over, under, or around. And so I think you have to address in political terms the real issues which walls don't solve. Now, that being said, I don't generalize beyond specific factual situations. With respect to the wall proposed by Mr. Trump, I do not favor the creation of a wall along the border between the United States and Mexico. I think it would be a foolish act which would exacerbate relations between the United States and other countries, and would not be a solution to the problem that it purports to, which is to keep Mexicans out. The reality, as we know, although you don't hear it in the debate, is that net migration is the other way now. There are more Mexicans going back to Mexico than there are coming here. That excludes the reality that we are seeing increasing numbers from other Central and Latin American countries. And that's part of the problem. But look, we have had an immigration policy and immigration problems throughout American history. There's absolutely nothing new in the fact that there are some Americans who resent immigrants. That's the hard fact of our history. The only immigrants, paradoxically, who were not resented at the time they came were the only group of Americans who came involuntarily, African Americans, who came in bondage, welcomed by those who brought them here because they were slaves. But he wrote a book about the French in Maine. The French faced discrimination. A fellow I know about, Dyke Hendrickson, wrote a book about the Irish in Maine. You know, when the Irish were coming into Maine early in the 19th century, the Maine legislature established a militia to protect Mainers from Irish entering across the Canadian border. It was, of course, a reflection on travel and distance at the time that they didn't realize that they had about one militiaman for every 10 miles of forest. So they poured in and the militia was resolved. But everybody here remembers stories, Irish need not apply. And the cartoons in American newspapers that portrayed Irish as apes in human forms. The Jews in America experienced tremendous discrimination. I live in Manhattan in an apartment building that was built by wealthy Jews 100 years ago because these were brilliant, successful, wealthy, refined people. They weren't admitted into the fancy buildings on Park Avenue. They couldn't get into the private clubs. They couldn't get into the country club. There are all kinds of people who are old enough to remember discrimination and hostility to Jews coming into America. There are undoubtedly Italian Americans here who experienced discrimination. There's nothing new about this. is just directed at a different group. And look, my mother was an immigrant. She made it on one of the last boats into Ellis Island before the first restricted immigration laws were passed. We can't accept into America everybody who wants to come here. That's a physical reality. For 175 years we did, just about, but we can't do it anymore. And so we have to establish reasonable procedures to govern the practices of other people entering this country, and we have to try to enforce them as realistically and humanely as we can. But arousing hostility toward immigrants of a particular group, while as American as the past practices show, is not the right policy today as it wasn't then. And I'll close with just one example. Steve Jobs' father was born in Syria. Jeff Bezos' adopted father was born in Cuba. Would America be a better country had they not been able to come here? And secondly, in a pro-American sense, would Steve Jobs have been able to create Apple if he grew up in Damascus? Or Jeff Bezos create Amazon if he grew up in Havana? The answer we all know to both questions is no. So bringing people in, having people come here and create and add their skills and talent and their loyalty to our country is something that we should encourage with reasonable rules and laws, but demonization and discrimination and hostility to particular groups because of color, religion, race, or otherwise, that to me, while we've had a lot of it in our history, we have always been able to overcome it and look at the contributions that people have made to our country. So that's my answer to the question of Trump.
Did you have a question right here? Yes.
Yes, I have a question about, you were a judge for a short time, but I know that to me you represent some of the standards of the judiciary that I so admire and felt good about as a young person growing up in the state of Maine. I am very concerned about civil discussion and the judiciary, but that if the public doesn't have or see those standards as something real, and that we're losing our sense of what the judiciary is supposed to be and how they can behave and what we should be expecting of them and wanting to know.
Yes, well, I was very fortunate that when I was United States Attorney.
If I could just, let me try to encapsulate that because I think someone behind in the back didn't quite hear it. That, you know, the judiciary, what does it mean these days? And what is the significance and what is the value? So maybe if you could proceed.
Well, I was very fortunate when I was United States Attorney in Maine. I appeared almost daily in court, and Maine then only had one federal judge. It was Judge Edward Janeau, one of the truly greatest judicial figures in our state and nation's history, who was a tower of integrity, intelligence, and you knew when you stood in his court that you obeyed the rules, that you fought as hard as you could, but you had to do it within the rules and do it fairly. And that's what I tried to do when I became a federal judge. And I often said to myself, what would Judge Janeau do in a situation like this? One of, I think, growing problems in our country is the politicization of the judiciary. I believe that what distinguishes our country from others is not so much our military might or our economic strength, important as they are, but keep in mind that the United States was a great nation long before it was a great military power or economic power. This was a great nation on the day on which the Declaration of Independence and then the day on which the Constitution was adopted. It is American ideals that what appeals to people. There are millions and millions of immigrants in this country. There are probably some in this room. Has anybody here ever heard of an immigrant who said, I came to America because you have the best cruise missiles? They all come, no matter where they come from, for the same things: freedom and opportunity. And you get individual freedom, freedom from oppression by government, and you get opportunity, economic growth, development, where you have an independent judicial system, where the freedom of the individual is recognized and vindicated, and where business investment can be made safely and securely, knowing that we have a court system that is independent. Now, in many states, increasingly, judges are being elected, and they're being drawn into political campaigns, and they're financed in a way that I think is a very dangerous and negative trend. And I think our own federal judiciary, it's always been somewhat political, but I think it's gotten a lot more so in recent years, and I think it does represent a threat to the very foundation of what has made our country successful. Our highest priorities, our individual liberty, the freedom of the individual, and the sovereignty of the people, the protection of the rights of minorities and those who don't possess power or status. And those are the twin pillars of democracy that we have to keep in alignment if we want to succeed, as we try to make possible the reality of opportunity for everyone.
You know, I'm going to co-opt a question that many might want to ask now, and then I think you wanted to read a little of your book.
Yeah.
But talk a little about what you see happening in November. Who do you think the nominees will be? And will it be a chaotic time, or how do you see this?
You mean I haven't angered anybody in the audience yet, so you want to provoke it before I walk out? Well, I'm a Democrat. I support Secretary Clinton for the nomination. I think that Mr. Trump and Senator Sanders have both struck a responsive chord, in part because of their repeated concerns about the American political process. I think it is corrupt. I think it should be changed, and I think that the most likely route to change is through the election of Secretary Clinton, and I think she has the experience and judgment that she should prevail, and I think she will prevail in both the nominating process and the general election, although I will add that I'm one of many who believe that Donald Trump could not win the Republican nomination when people asked me 6 months ago, and I think I've been proven wrong, along with many others, although we don't know for sure what's going to happen.
Some people seem annoyed by him. Are you annoyed by Trump? Or are you too measured and moderate?
No, I'm not at all annoyed. I mean, everybody's got a chance to have their say. And the fact is, lots of people go home, turn on the television saying, I wonder what he said today. It's actually attracted people to the process. I mean, I don't agree with his approach. I mean, I don't think you can tell whether or not he can solve a problem because he hasn't ever suggested a way other than that he'll do it, or he'll talk to them and they'll get it done, and so forth. It may be a new standard in politics, a new mechanism for approaching it. But I think he has struck a chord on the money issue, as have Senator Sanders. And I'll ask you a question. I ask this of all audiences I appear before. How many people here believe that their elected representatives in the Congress are more responsive to their constituents than they are to their donors? Which is which? Constituents. We got a couple of hands. Very few hands ever raised. The overwhelming majority, 99.9% of audiences respond by not raising hands because people believe the system has been corrupted. And I believe it has been, not in the historic sense of, Senator Dyke, if you will cast a vote this way, I'll give you $25,000 in cash. We're fortunate. There's very, very little of that in our society, and certainly at the national level. The corruption is in your answer to my question. The bond of trust between the people of this country and their elected officials has been severed. And it's been severed by the belief that money interest is the prevailing factor in the views of elected officials in making decisions. And the sad reality is that it's true. They're overwhelmed and dominated by money. The Supreme Court decision in Citizens United will go down as one of the worst decisions ever made by any Supreme Court in American history. To be fair to the court, they didn't create the problem. Money in politics is as old as humankind. But basically what they did is they said, look, there's a fire, let's put some gasoline on it. I challenge anybody, this is an intelligent, literate audience, this is a literary festival, I challenge any of you to go read the opinion. Read it. It doesn't make any sense. It describes an American political process that doesn't exist. And I wish I had I usually carry cards with me. I didn't bring them with quotes from the case, and I read them, and people laugh at them. Quotes from the case. It doesn't make any sense. The court overruled prior Supreme Courts, which had said that there can constitutionally be imposed reasonable restraints on contributions to political campaigns and spending by political campaigns. And the current Supreme Court said, no, the Constitution prohibits that. Now, I think what's going to happen, and I hope what's going to happen, is when a new Ninth Justice is appointed, that Supreme Court is going to say, well, wait a minute, this Supreme Court was wrong, and the earlier Supreme Court was right, that we can constitutionally and legally establish reasonable constraints on contributions to and spending by political campaigns. And here's the real tragedy. Not only are we now witnessing a spectacular increase in the amount of money going into politics, we are experiencing a spectacular decline in the transparency of who is giving the money. Senator Rubio, when his committee announced in a press release that they were raising $20 million to run television ads in his behalf during the campaign, and they put in the press release that they were not going to disclose the names of the donors because they're not required to do so. I didn't think much of him as a candidate, but I give him an A for candor. All the candidates do it in both parties, but they don't like to acknowledge it, and they dodge questions about it. But the amount of money going in is at an all-time high, and the amount of knowledge you and every other American have of who's giving money to whom is less than you've ever had. So we're getting the worst of both worlds, and that's why the public feels that the system isn't working and it has to change.
Well, this has been great. You know, the senator remarked that he, wanted to spend a little time out there signing books for people. I hope you brought your books. Some books will be for sale out there. And Senator, because of the time is going the way it is, I think we're going to have to end it here. But I think what we'd like to do is have you seated here for the next 5 minutes. The senator is going to go off into the next room to sign some books. And he said to me, well, to be a real author, you have to say something and do some reading. And I'm afraid we just don't have the time right now to do it.
Does that mean I'm not a real author?
No, you're a real author when you go in there and you sign the books.
Okay, thank you all very much.